Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into something you probably consume it every single day. Maybe you're even having some right now while you're watching this. We're going to unpack the unbelievable, world-shaping history behind a totally everyday commodity, and that is sugar. It's a story that bridges ancient medicine, brutal global empires, and, as we'll see, the very fuel of the modern industrial age. So let's just jump right in.
So here's a pretty wild question to start us off. How exactly did a simple blade of grass manage to build empires and enslave millions? I mean, it's a staggering thought, right? Sugar didn't just passively exist in the background of human history, not at all. It was an active, aggressive driver of global economics and human migration. As we explore the massive global impact of sugar today, you're going to see this escalating snowball effect. What starts out as a neat exotic curiosity eventually morphs into this insatiable global addiction that literally redraws the map of the world. Okay, to really wrap our heads around the sheer scale of this snowball effect, just take a look at this number, 18 pounds. Back in the year 1700, the average British person consumed maybe 4 pounds of sugar per year. But by the year 1800, just 1 century later, that number had jumped to 18 pounds per person. That is a massive, massive societal shift. Sugar was rapidly transitioning from this incredibly rare luxury, basically reserved for kings and queens, into an absolute daily necessity for the common citizen. But how did it even get to that point? Well, sugar's story actually starts by slowly crawling out of the South Pacific. We're talking 10,000 years ago in New Guinea, where indigenous people first discovered this tall, thick grass and realized they could chew the raw stalk for its sweet juice. Fast forward a bit to 3500 BC in India, and farmers there actually figured out how to boil that juice down and crystallize it. Then, during the Muslim agricultural revolution, around 820 CE, Arab entrepreneurs adopted those methods. They built the very first large-scale mills and refineries, which spread the crop all across the Mediterranean. And finally, in the 11th century, European crusaders bumped into what they called sweet salt in the Holy Land and hauled it back to a pretty stunned Christian Europe. Actually, there's a super fascinating linguistic connection here that I love. The ancient Sanskrit word used in India for crystallized sugar is khanda. That is literally the direct root of our modern English word candy. And making that crystal was a massive technological leap. By crystallizing the juice, India revolutionized sugar. They turned it from a highly perishable stock, which you had to chew almost immediately, into a transportable, shelf-stable product. And, in those ancient times, it was treated with immense reverence. Physicians actually prescribed it as a sacred medicine for everything from stomach problems to severe headaches. It's kind of crazy to think about how the economic value of sugar shifted over time. The arc is just wild. In the Roman Empire, like I mentioned, it was an ultra-rare medicine. Pliny the Elder was writing about it in the 1st century, specifically noting it was only for medical purposes. Back then, a single pound could cost a common laborer an entire month's wages. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, and Venice has monopolized the European trade, literally locking sugar away behind apothecary counters right next to rare spices and opium. Yet by the time we hit the British Empire in 1850, it had become a dirt-cheap, daily calories source used to fuel working-class factory laborers. But the journey between those two extremes, that's where the history of sugar takes a very dark turn. We really have to confront a solemn reality here. Because sugarcane requires a hot, tropical climate, Europe just couldn't grow it natively. So as European demand completely skyrocketed, Portugal started setting up the very first European-controlled sugar plantations on Atlantic islands in the 1400s. And the labor? It was backbreaking and incredibly dangerous. When Columbus brought cane cuttings over to the Caribbean in 1493, that insatiable European demand birthed a brutal, sprawling plantation system in the New World. To feed their craving for sweetness, European powers turned to enslaved African labor, setting in motion one of the absolute most horrific human tragedies in modern history. The horrific human cost of this global demand really boils down to one staggering number: 7 years. That was the incredibly grim average life expectancy of an enslaved person once they arrived on a Caribbean sugar plantation. The conditions of planting, harvesting, and boiling the cane in extreme, sweltering heat were so brutal, and the labor was so relentless that plantation owners literally ran the numbers. They calculated that it was actually cheaper for them to work people to death and purchase replacements than to provide even basic humane living conditions. So sugar didn't just benefit from slavery, it fundamentally drove it.
Let's map out the economic engine that fueled this tragedy, the triangle trade. It was this relentless cycle. Sugarcane grown in the Caribbean produced molasses, right? That molasses was shipped north to places like Rhode Island to be distilled into rum. That rum was then loaded on a ship, sailed to West Africa, and used as currency to purchase African captives. Finally, those enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic on the horrific Middle Passage, back to the Caribbean where they were forced to grow even more sugar. At this point, sugar was the single most valuable commodity in the Atlantic world, and it drove a system that enslaved over 12 million Africans. Eventually, though, a moral awakening sparked real pushback. Notice the gold lettering on this antique East India sugar bowl here. Inscribed right on the front, clear as day, are the words, "Not made by slaves." As we move through the 18th and 19th centuries, the staggering human costs of Caribbean sugar became a massive political issue. This bowl basically represents an early consumer boycott. Abolitionists were actively urging citizens to buy their sugar from the East Indies instead, where slave labor wasn't used. It perfectly illustrates a growing moral awareness among everyday people regarding the bloody origins of their afternoon tea.
All right, let's accelerate the timeline a bit because global politics is about to completely upend the sugar monopoly. Enter the 1806 blockade. During the Napoleonic Wars, the British Royal Navy aggressively blockaded French ports. And I mean aggressively. This completely cut France off from its supply of Caribbean cane sugar. Suddenly, Napoleon is facing a massive sugar crisis at home. The French people wanted their sweetness, and Napoleon desperately needed a domestic source that the British Navy couldn't touch.
So, where does Napoleon find his answer? Science. Decades earlier, in 1747, a German chemist named Andreas Margaroff made a huge discovery. Temperate climate white beets contained sucrose that was chemically identical to tropical cane sugar. Later, his student, Franz Acard, actually figured out how to extract it. Seeing this as a total lifeline, Napoleon went all in. In 1811, he ordered 32,000 hectares of French farmland to be planted exclusively with sugar beets. By the very next year, 1812, an industrialist named Benjamin de Lessert perfected the extraction process on a commercial scale. Science had finally and permanently broken the ancient tropical cane monopoly.
And the results of this shift? Absolutely explosive. Look at this growth. In 1811, French beet sugar was essentially just an experimental novelty, but by 1812, production had jumped to 1.1 million kilograms. By 1813, France was turning out millions of pounds of domestic beet sugar every single year. This massive spike created a fierce, direct rivalry between tropical cane sugar and European beet sugar. And what happens when two massive global industries compete? Prices plummet. The world was suddenly flooded with incredibly cheap, totally abundant sweetness, and it completely changed global economics.
Which brings us right to the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, where this newly cheap sugar met its absolute perfect partner, bitter tea. See, Britain was importing massive amounts of tea from China, but honestly, it was way too bitter for a lot of palates. But if you added this newly cheap sugar to it, suddenly it became highly palatable. Delicious, even. The British government actually went out of its way to actively lower tariffs on sugar imports specifically to make sure this combo stayed affordable for the masses. Sugar and tea officially became the lifeblood, the literal fuel of the British Empire's working class.
And why did the industrialists absolutely love this dynamic? Well, feeding a factory full of workers required cheap, fast energy. Sugar provided incredibly rapid calories. Factory laborers were working grueling 12 to 14-hour shifts, day in and day out. A cup of heavily sweetened tea combined with, say, a sugary jam sandwich delivered a massive spike of energy that kept them moving on the factory floor. For the factory owners, this was basically a miracle. It completely replaced the expense and the downtime required to provide substantial, nutritious meals. As a direct result, jams, candies, and sweetened drinks became the dietary staples of the modern working class. When you step back and look at the incredible arc we've traced today, this quote really hits the nail on the head. The shift from luxury to staple changed the world more than almost any other commodity in history. Think about how far we've traveled in this explainer. From indigenous peoples chewing a raw stalk in New Guinea, to an elite medicine locked away in Venetian apothecaries, to a devastating engine for human slavery, all the way to becoming the cheap, fast fuel of the Industrial Revolution. The global impact of sugar is just undeniable. It has quite literally molded the modern world we live in today. Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. If sugar shaped global empires, drove the horrific enslavement of millions, and fueled the grueling shifts of the Industrial Revolution, well, what is the hidden cost of the 50 pounds or more that the average person consumes today? When you stir that spoonful into your coffee tomorrow morning, just take a brief moment to reflect on the immense, heavy, and deeply complicated historical price of our modern sweet tooth. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope you learned a lot.